The properties of equality in algebra that you have used before include the addition property of equality, subtraction property of equality, multiplication property of equality, and division property of equality. And then there's always a substitution property. Okay, so we're going to look at these individually, but I'm telling you, like, you have done these things before in your life. So if you have, I'm going to do a little equation here. I'm going to make something up. Okay, so here we have a given equation, and we can use the addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division property of equality to solve the equation. We can use other properties as well. So here, the addition property just says you can add a value on both sides of an equation. If you're given an equation, then this is valid because what you do on one side of the equation, you do on the other. Same thing, you can subtract for subtraction property. You could subtract a quantity on both sides of an equation. This should say C. Okay, so you can subtract the same quantity on both sides of the equation, and that's called the subtraction property of equality. Multiplication property of equality is where if you're given an equation, then you can multiply the same number on both sides of the equation. And again, the division property of equality, as long as what you're dividing by doesn't equal 0, then you can divide both sides of an equation by the same quantity. And then also, if you know that two quantities are equal to each other, you can substitute a value in for that quantity. So here's what that's going to look like. So first we'll use the distributive property. And then you just label on the side. And you can abbreviate if you want to. Okay, so we'll subtract 20 off of both sides. So we're going to use the subtraction property of equality. Okay, and then when you do this and you say, okay, well, 20 plus negative 20 is going to be 0, so that's the inverse property of equality. And so you keep just going in that same manner, and every time you do something, you're going to see that you get to label each step of your work with a property. It starts to get pretty simple with some practice. So we're going to actually do it here, where I don't really necessarily think we're going to fill in the explanation, but you always should have a reason, right? So if you're solving an equation and you write the equation down, the first thing you're going to write is always given. The first reason is always given. Okay, so let's look and see what happened here. From this equation to this equation, looks like someone distributed that -4 in there. So just so you have the explanation. Okay. Here we have, it looks like someone added 8 on both sides. So we're going to use the addition property of equality. Please feel free to abbreviate as long as it's clear. And we actually used two properties here. Every time you use the addition or subtraction property of equality, you're also using the inverse property and substitution, but we'll get into, because 80 plus 8 is actually 88, but we'll get into that later. And then here we can divide both sides by -44. And then here we have subtract 44. Oh no, just kidding, that's division. Subtraction, silly. Divide by -44. So we're going to do that, and we're going to divide. So we divided, so we're using the division property of equality. And every time you do this, this is -44 divided by -44. So that's really like saying -44 times its reciprocal, which is the inverse property as well. Okay, so you're going to really just be able to, for each step of work, show will show each step of work and also then give a reason for why you're allowed to do that step of work. So let's look at another one. I'm going to skip the explanation on this one. Just ignore it. Because I'm verbally explaining. Okay, so the first thing you're doing is that you were given this equation. Then you are here. It looks like somebody multiplied by 2 on both sides to get rid of this 2. Okay, which we're allowed to do. Multiplication property of equality. And what happens here is that you have divided by 2 being canceled out by multiplying by 2. So this here is also the inverse property. Boom. Okay, and then so let's look and see. And if you're having trouble figuring out like, okay, what are we doing to get from this step to this step? Just think about what you would do to go from here to here. And then you might be able to figure it out. Like, what was different? What happened here? How'd you get to here? So this is subtract x on both sides, because we went from 6x to 5x and we went from x to no x. So that would be the subtraction property of equality. And the inverse and substitution, actually, but that's okay. I keep saying that. Okay, so 6x minus x, the reason I keep saying substitution is that 6x minus x, we know that this can be simplified or substituted by 5x, and it's the same thing. Okay, so now we're going to add 4 on both sides. To go from here to here was the addition property of equality. And the inverse, obviously, of course. And then here, to get from here to here, we're going to do division property of equality. And the inverse. You don't have to write the word and, but you do have to write both. So each time, so the one thing that I know, and I just did that there at the end for a second, is that you have to say that the first thing's given, and then you're basically trying, like, this reason tells you how you got this step. Okay, so I know some people want to put this a step above. So we're really essentially saying, okay, from here to here, we do this, because we're allowed to go from here to here because of this reason. We're allowed to go from here to here because of this reason. We're allowed to go from here to here because of this reason. And then the orange one here, we're allowed to go from here to here. We're allowed to go from here to here because of this reason. Okay? And then end, put a little square at the end to say that you're done.